Today I have a pleasure of speaking with Dominik Lejman, a famous painter currently hiding between Poznan and Berlin.
Correct.
First question I'd like to ask you is about painting. What exactly painting is for you right now?
Painting is a matter of my activity, and I think what I can say about painting at the moment is that it's very often misunderstood. This particular discipline has been unavoidably connected with my life in terms of the way how I perceive it, not only as a tool of expression, but also as the way how I can somehow mentally survive in this socio-pathological reality that we all deal with.
So it's like kind of a self-therapy for you.
It's always a self-therapy, especially that particular niche provides you, in terms of the low budget, provides you the amazing luxury of really being dependent upon yourself. As long as you do not place your work strategically in terms of the way how you would think about the painting as the means of expression which would necessarily be connected with its own tautology. For me, painting has been always the way how I perceive or how I can express the things that sort of interest me, and the things that for some reason may be also interested for the viewers of my works, as a particular type of optics. Because I think in general terms that what's most important at the moment, if we could think about like a broader discussion about painting, is more the question of its specific optics rather than the tool. Tools should be effective, but the most important thing is that I can use all sorts of tools. I can use different tools in a very different way. As long as I'm a painter, I'm using the tool in a completely different way, as long as it's functional, for my own means of understanding what's particular interesting in terms of the perspective which is being provided by the painter and not by the filmmaker, or the illustrator, or anybody else who could be attached to any kind of a tool. So the way how I'm using the painting tools means that I'm using particular optical idea of and also historically nourished idea what the painting was and what the image is, rather than the visual information is. I mean, I'm dealing with the visual information, but what's most important thing for me is how I'm translating the visual information into the particular optical way of the painter's mind, the way how I think about the surrounding reality, or how I can effectively reflect upon that reality from the painter's perspective. So the painter's perspective is always a superficial perspective, because painters were always attached to the surface. So I can be superficial in terms of the way how I look at the surrounding reality, and I think it is a great privilege.
Is it only about crossing the borders of a traditional painting?
It's not about crossing the borders at all. I don't feel that I'm crossing any borders whatsoever.
Somehow it is, because what you do is not a traditional way of painting. Like,
it is absolutely traditional way of painting, but the reality that I'm surrounded by is not necessarily the way how we used to perceive it.
You use different tools than painters 200 years ago.
Yes, the painters were using different tools according to the art history. They were using particular paints. Firstly, they were tempera paints, then there were oil paints, and then there were prefabricated paints. Then there were ready-made paints too. So if you think about the progression of the tools, it has always been that type of a progression. Now we're dealing with loads of other tools that are very often the prosthetical tools in terms of the image creation. But the way how I'm using the tools is not necessarily prosthetical. What I mean is that there's a huge difference between the illustration. There's a huge difference between the way how I can reflect upon what I see and the way how I deal with the image rather than I deal with the visual information. And this is very often the problem of misunderstanding. That very often people, for example, we use painting in terms of their attachment to the paint, not necessarily do painting. Very often they do illustration. They do illustration of ideas. They do create the certain type of messages. They want to sell their own political ideas, or they want to sell their own any kind of ideas. But it's not necessarily the painting. Very often it's the illustration of my. I want to illustrate the ideas. I want to illustrate my thoughts. I want to reflect upon what I think, but it's not necessarily the way how I perceive painting, because I do perceive painting in a very naive way. I do perceive painting as a right to just stay on the surface. And I think that this is a very powerful tool at the moment in terms of that kind of luxury, that using a camera very often, they're using the tool which deals with this more or less applying a certain politics involved with the creation of an image. It's not necessarily the only way to create the sort of an art which can be interesting, or which could be interesting from the conceptual point of view, from the purpose, which can be very often critical. But I do believe in the criticism that is not necessarily coming up with the message. I do believe with the criticism, which is very often this kind of a criticism which comes out of simple surveillance. We surveil the environment. I surveil what happens. I create the sites, and I create a certain type of overall recording of for example, phenomenal crowds that I do not control, but I think my distance to the actual engagement of the crowd, of the way how people interact within each other, without engaging myself into the actual choreography, it puts me in a position of somebody who takes things superficially. But if you look at the surface, I think very often you can reflect much stronger upon what's really happening within a particular time, with a particular moment with a history. So I think that is a bit of the difference, and that's why I strongly insist to be taken more of a painter rather than somebody who is a filmmaker, or who's a reporter, or who's any kind of a person who creates an image which would have a history, which could be which could have the linear plot. So more or less that's how I see myself as a painter, which means as somebody who is very superficial. But it's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily mean that the being superficial is not to be critical. I mean, if I record the crowd at the Holy Mass with the people who just stand and do not look at each other for most of the Mass, and then they just look at each other for 4 seconds, at the moment of shared design of peace, it means something, because the proportion between the indifference and the proportion between seeing another person and perceiving another human being, this for me, this is very much enough of a comment of a particular time, particular moment, but the particular place that I being somehow influenced by. This is a footage which is the negative of the performance, which I organized with 32 sky divers who created the structure of a cathedral, which was the exact recreation of the shape of the main vault of the Roman Gothic cathedral in Durham, north of England.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that it was supposed to last only for 60 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important in terms of way how I perceive the notion of ephemerality in terms of my work, and the way how I think I subvert the symbolical element that exists within a cathedral as a sort of the cultural icon that was supposed to, that always in our collective memory is always supposed to last for centuries. This one lasted for 60 seconds. Why did I do this? Because I'm thoroughly interested in the way how the notion of a permanence and impermanence exists in a contemporary reality, in terms of maybe the question of the human relation, which happen to very often prevail, and I think in this term be maybe more of a reflection about how such a cultural symbols could be transferred into the performance, which lasts 60 seconds. The human interaction in many cases, and this is a part of the whole thing, seem to be, I think, at the present times, that are very unstable. They are all related to the notion of being unstable. We have so many elements in the present reality that deal with the idea of unstable. We deal with the images that are not permanent. We deal with the projections. We communicate with the ghosts via Skype or via other means of communication. When you discuss with each other, we happen to be more ephemeral than we used to be, and that's why also I think the symbolics of interaction should somehow reflect upon that notion of a time. And I think for me this is one of the most powerful statements that I ever did, because to do something which refers to the permanent structure that appears in the air when those people are free falling with a speed of 200 kilometers from the 6,000 meters, just to create the shape of a cathedral, I think make people wonder what's really permanent, what's impermanent in the reality that we deal with.